Um, Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Amy Commander, and I'm Director of Cancer Survivorship at the Mass General Cancer Center at Newton-Wellesley. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our survivorship webinar series entitled Thriving After Cancer, Strategies and State of Mind. June is National Cancer Survivor Month, and this month provides us with an opportunity for all 16.9 million cancer survivors across the country to celebrate their milestones and recognize those who have supported them along the way. It is also an opportunity for those who have not been affected by cancer to learn and understand the challenges that accompany cancer survivorship. This year, we look forward to honoring cancer survivors with this three-part webinar series. I am very excited about tonight's talk entitled The Possibility of Thriving, What Cancer Can Teach Us About Navigating a Pandemic. It is now my honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nancy Rappaport. Dr. Rappaport is a graduate of Princeton University and Tufts University School of Medicine. A board-certified child and adolescent psychiatrist, Dr. Rappaport is currently a part-time associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Her research, teaching, and clinical expertise focus on the collaboration between education and psychiatry. After graduating from Princeton, Dr. Rappaport worked as a science teacher at an innovative elementary school in Harlem, New York, where she advocated for support for struggling families. Her life-altering experiences in Harlem inspired her to enter medical school and would help launch a robust career. Graduating from Tufts School of Medicine in 1988, Dr. Rappaport completed an internship in pediatrics and a residency in adult psychiatry, both at Massachusetts General Hospital, before completing a fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry at Cambridge Hospital. It was during this fellowship that Dr. Rappaport formed a long-standing relationship with the Cambridge Public Schools. She received numerous awards, including the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry's Sidney Berman Award for the school-based study and treatment of learning disorders and mental illness in 2012. She also received the Cambridge Health Alliance's Art of Healing Award in 2013, an award given to one who transcends boundaries, joyfully embraces humanity, and profoundly inspires the healing of body and spirit. We are so fortunate to learn from Dr. Rappaport tonight.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me, and I send a virtual hug to you in your home, wishing that we were in person, but honored to be asked to talk with you about what cancer and a pandemic can teach us about navigating uncertainty. So when I was first diagnosed with cancer and having to make all the decisions, and what you're looking at is looking in the rearview mirror. And when I was first diagnosed with cancer and having to make all the decisions and figure out so much, an oncologist said to me, maybe it wasn't you, Amy, but it could have been a wonderful doc like Amy, someday you'll be looking at this in your rear view mirror. And I thought, no way. Everything about, and many of you can probably remember the moments of being diagnosed and the sort of pivotal shock that can happen, and that the experience was destabilizing. And it was hard to imagine a world where I would be 150% better. And I can reassure you, I had breast cancer 5 years ago, and I am 150% better, but it was scary. And with the pandemic, this chapter of the past 15 months is hopefully receding into our rearview mirror. So I want us to just think together about what will be today, and talk about the importance of staying grounded in the present moment while dancing with uncertainty, re-examining our relationships and our expectations of each other, and a shout out to all of you who are supporting people with cancer, and finding places and rituals that provide solace and comfort, and embracing your narrative so that you can heal. So let's start by talking about staying grounded in the present moment while dancing with uncertainty. And what you're looking at is quicksand. And I want to acknowledge that staying grounded in the present moment is a really, really hard thing to do. And when you're trying to navigate uncertainty, it can feel like being in quicksand. And it's a tall expectation to stay grounded. It's not easy. And when you're dealing with trauma, and I think that, having cancer and going through the pandemic, the reason that you want to stay grounded is because you need to make a lot of decisions. And the uncertainty can catapult you into a mind fog. How many of you have been like thinking a Monday is a blur day and trying to remember, like, what year was it, 2019, 2020? And when and how this will end is a major weight that weighs on us. It certainly weighed on us with the pandemic, and it can weigh on us with cancer. And I like this saying, waiting is the invalidation of the present. And I think all of us have learned some incredible things during the waiting time of the pandemic, during the waiting time of having cancer, how we manage stress, what our priorities are, and how we develop endurance with the uncertainty, and how to navigate, in the case of both the pandemic and cancer, how we navigate our relationship with mortality. And when I say waiting is the invalidation of the present, if you're waiting for something and you're looking into the future, then and hoping just all you want to do is to get on the other side, that can be unsettling. And I want to share with you, if any of you aren't familiar with Peggy Huddleston, she has a wonderful website called healingfaster.com. And she has an exercise that's going to relate to this idea about how to manage time in the context of cancer. Her studies show that actually if you 2 weeks before an operation meditate, and there's a tape that she has, that you need 30% less pain meds. And one of the exercises that Peggy Huddleston has you do in the meditation is to imagine yourself in the future, and that gives you the motivation to go through the scary parts of the cancer that you might be going through. And for me, it was, and I don't have grandkids yet, love to have it, but don't. It was thinking of my grandkids graduating from high school, and me telling them that when I was in my mid-50s, that I'd had breast cancer, that I was scared, and that what had given me momentum and made me tenacious and made me inspired to hold on was thinking of being at their high school graduation. And that's not putting pressure on my kids to have grandkids, but it allowed me to kind of get unhinged from the terror of the uncertainty. And I wanted to share another concept that I find helpful. Michelle Garcia Winner, she works with autistic kids. Social thinking is something that she does. And she has this really interesting idea about time travel. And so, I like that idea of moving back and forth between our life and finding times that we were competent and kind of moving it forward to comfort us. And so I found it fascinating to me that with that meditating on the future could actually decrease your needs for pain meds. And then at the same time, staying present grounds us. And so I think the waiting time can be, and I don't know where some of you may be in the process of having cancer, but it can be a challenge. It can be a challenge, quite frankly, every time I get a mammogram when you wait for those results. And it can be very hard to stay in the present. And whether it's the pandemic or whether it's cancer, we've had to find strategies to navigate the waiting. And this is just to remind me to tell you that grandchild story, which I did. So, so here's a strategy that I wanted to share with you. During the pandemic, I was anointed initially by the Boston Catholic schools to do and then subsequently have done a lot of webinars for parents and educators about navigating the pandemic. And one of the strategies that's been essential is to take inventory of what we can control and what we can't control. And Lord knows all of us are probably very familiar with this. So in these webinars, I would talk about, initially at the beginning of the pandemic, we can't control if others follow the rules of social or physical distancing. We can't control predicting what will happen. We can't control the amount of toilet paper at the store, or how long this will last, or how others react and other people's motives. But we can control how much time we spend doom scrolling, our own kindness and grace, how we follow physical distancing, and a positive attitude, and finding fun things to do at home. And I remember reading, if any of you don't know it, I really enjoyed it, Survival Lessons by Alice Hoffman. And she is a breast cancer survivor and a very well-known author. And she talks about choices that she encouraged anyone with cancer to be thinking about, choosing how you spend your time, choosing to plan for the future, choosing to dream, choosing who your heroes are, looking at the tree outside your window for an hour without being ashamed that you're wasting time. Choosing, this is a key one, whose advice you take. And choosing your family, choosing who you let be close, and maintaining the boundaries where you need to. And speaking of choosing your family, when you're navigating this kind of uncertainty, it's important to re-examine our relationships and our expectations of each other. So I think as we're coming out of the pandemic, and also I was encouraging families at the beginning of the pandemic to look at and think of the categories and discussions with their families about what they value. And the values could be good deeds, how we spend time as a family, how we take care of the house, how we nurture creativity in our family, how we deal with finances, how we find things that we're passionate about, how we do self-care, and what our spiritual life is. And I think I found that this had an equivalency to the sort of bolt of lightning that happened for me with having cancer, where I really did some soul searching and realigned some of the ways that I was spending time to really prioritize. And I think there is something to visiting mortality, whether it's in the pandemic or with cancer, where you realize life is short and you don't want to waste it. And you want to make sure that your day-to-day life reflects the values that you have. And as you heard from Amy, I'm a child psychiatrist. And so this is a slide talking about, there's a woman, Nancy McWilliams, and she is a psychoanalyst who talked about during the pandemic that there was a real desire for an omniscient parent, that even if we are in our 50s and 60s, that there's a desire to be taken care of. And she talked about that her 2-year-old, when it was raining outside, was furious at her for not being able to stop the rain. And that's not what we can do. If you are comforting someone who has cancer, you can't get I mean, fortunately, we have people like Amy in terms of oncologists and radiologists and people who are going to help us get rid of the cancer. But it's really around embracing each other and being tender with each other and providing a shelter of not being alone and bearing witness to what's happening. And this can be challenging. The stakes with which we measure our relationship when we're in the height of fear and uncertainty, it can create stress in a relationship. And I once heard talking about parenting is like wading through risky waters and holding on to the railings. And that's what I feel like also with certainly during this time, that's what parents have been doing for their kids, is showing up and being there and having that support is incredibly valuable to those of us going through cancer. And so I want to just show you what I'm looking at. This is my husband, and this is me on the top. And we are skinning up the top of a mountain. And you can see there's a sign that says, this is your decision point. Backcountry risks include death. Okay, it's, so you might wonder why I'm smiling, but there's so many times I feel like, whether it's been the pandemic or going through cancer, where I use a concept when I talk about the, which is called yes and. So it's really the idea that there can be both joy and there can be bullshit. And so you can both love your partner and be incredibly grateful by their side, and you can want to kill them. And part of surviving the pandemic or surviving cancer, if we're going to be honest, and I adore my husband, I've been married to him for 31 years, but you want to make room for both. You want to make room for these sort of contradictory feelings that you may have at times. And I did a one-woman show, and here it was at Mount Auburn Cemetery. I'd fallen in love with Mount Auburn Cemetery. And at the end, I shared with the people who had come to it that my flock surrounds me and I dance around my fear. And healing is about letting your people surround you as you're going through the ordeal of cancer. It's being vulnerable, and it's allowing people to take care of you at a time when it's scary. So again, I think finding places and rituals that provide solace and comfort, that's a cornerstone of getting through any stress. And we certainly saw it in the pandemic. This is the beginning. Well, what I want to say is I want to make a parallel too about the rituals, because during the pandemic and during cancer, many of us are restricted in terms of where we can go and how we can seek comfort. And during the pandemic, I thought there was a beautiful moment at the very beginning in March of 2020 when all these religious rituals were happening. There was Passover, there was Easter, there was Ramadan, and people weren't allowed into their structures of prayer. And yet, I thought it was like the Grinch Who Stole Christmas moment, where still people found a way to comfort each other and come together. And for me, like I mentioned, it was Mount Auburn Cemetery. That's the Dell. If any of you haven't been there, I know you all are in Newton, but Cambridge isn't that far away. And that had 2,000 people come at the opening of it back in 1834 on the right. That's a natural amphitheater, and there's 4,000 trees and over, oh gosh, I'm forgetting now, 100,000 monuments. So it's quite the place. But during the pandemic, people became bird watchers. They got into nature. They allowed within the limitations to find solace and comfort. And I don't know about you, but sometimes, whether it's with cancer or the pandemic, the whole, I hope you can hear me, right, Amy? Yeah, okay, good. The self-care movement kind of could feel a little bit overwhelming, but I think that hopefully when we are either going through cancer or pandemic, we've gotten more in touch with what actually nurtures us. And this is a picture by Faith Ringgold of picnicking on the grass, and just look at all those, what a delicious meal. I want to come, even though at some point it was probably couldn't because we were physical distancing. For me and my husband, we did for right after the insurrection, we had a ritual of drinking coffee and just writing down one thing that we were grateful for. And, there are all sorts of studies that talk about that. I have to say it did not last forever. We did for about 2 months, but finding those small things. I mean, for him, it was one time, it was the fact that Tom Brady won in Florida, but there was, that honing in and looking for the good. And one of the aspects of trauma when I work with kids is I talk about joy is the opposite of trauma. And so finding what nurtures us, what brings us as joy is incredibly important. And here's my fourth point: embracing your narrative so that you can heal. In my work, I've learned that now I'm a child psychiatrist, right? If I was a surgeon, I'd have a different lesson to give you, but I've learned that telling your story is an incredibly healing process. And even before cancer, I wrote a memoir about my mother's suicide. I was 4 years old when my mom died. And when I had my first child, who's now 31, I started to write a memoir in her wake. And then during cancer, I was not going to write another memoir. You should only write one memoir in your life. I had never acted, but I thought, someone suggested, why don't you do a one-woman show? And I was like, well, okay, well, the last time I've done a one-woman, any acting, I was the Wicked Witch of the West in 7th grade. But I can do this. And so this is a Crane's Beach scene where, whatever. And it's beyond being healing and comforting to have people listen. It was also empowering to feel like I've chosen to do this because I can. And so the name of it was about my relationship with Mount Auburn Cemetery and having breast cancer, thinking about mortality. The name of it was Regeneration. And it doesn't have to be a one-woman show. It could be filling a journal, gathering a group of friends, tell your story, an art project, knitting. This was, can you see it, you guys? This was the beautiful prayer shawl that one of my friends knit for me. So, but it's just tapping in at a moment when we can feel trepidation, tapping into our creative spirit and allowing it to propel us. And part of trauma is it interrupts the storytelling. And so as you tell a story, you're weaving together things that might be a broken narrative. So it helps you to make meaning and sense of something that may seem illogical. And just to take you down memory lane, here's some of what we've been through just in the pandemic. I talked about it before, but we had the lockdown where we weren't able to celebrate our rituals in the usual places that we might have. We had the shortage of toilet paper. We had the Black Lives Matters movement, and we had the police brutality, and which is unfortunately still sometimes happening. We had the death of Ruth Ginsburg. We had the elections. We had, is your head starting to spin? We had the insurrection. We had the election of the two senators at the same moment on this, almost within 24 hours of the insurrection. We had Biden, and then we had Amanda Gorman. And then schools, which is where I spend my life, there was no school, there was partly school, there was teachers getting vaccinated, which in my mind took way too long. And so it's been a roller coaster. And any of us who've had cancer, we know what that roller coaster can be like, And exercise I've been giving educators and have been encouraging them to do with their students is to ask themselves to fill a time capsule that represented their pandemic experience. So what you're looking at is a photographer who is in England who did a project with her son where she had him put on a large blanket the different things that he would put in his time capsule. So you see this wouldn't happen in Cambridge, but he has a gun, a water gun. He's got an airplane, he's got a mask, he's got his computer, some of his favorite books. And part of the challenge coming out of the pandemic is going to be supporting our families and our kids with both the apprehension of what the future is and how do we kind of wrap our narrative around it. And one of the things I would encourage all of us, this is a little bit of a detour, but I say it whenever I can when I'm public speaking, is to thank our kids, because our kids made major sacrifices for us. If we are immunocompromised, they stayed home to make sure we would be safe. And there's a lot of anxiety about what's going to happen in the future with our kids, and the fact that there was an uptick in anxiety, like no kidding, there was a pandemic and they might have been anxious, but actually the results of suicide, it hasn't been separated out by age yet, but is down by 5%. And I think there's a resiliency that comes from contributing, and our kids contributed to us. And that would be my take-home homework to you. So, but if you were to think about what would you fill in your time capsule, if you were an audience right now, I'd be asking you, and certainly feel free to put it in the chat box, but what would you put in your time capsule, whether it was for cancer or for the pandemic? Because that's your narrative. You own it. You get to write it. And another aspect I want to say is that, for the pandemic, I talk about the pandemic highlighter, and that there have been, I've been stunned by some of my patients and the way that they've risen to this occasion and provided support in their families and done better sometimes. Introverts have done better sometimes with the fact that the pandemic had a quieter tone to it and that there wasn't as much stimulation. Some kids on the spectrum learned better. So this is just a slide that actually came from Twitter, but it's a kid that's talking about how some of the things that she enjoyed with her family, and where she liked, they played the boombox and danced, her family. And then I want to be in her family because she cleaned up too. But and how we transition from this sort of comfortable, uncomfortable to whatever the new normal looks like is one of the questions that that we're going to be wrestling with. Similar to the time when, how there's transitions with cancer, like initially when you have cancer, and again, I'm thinking for myself individually, I don't want to take liberty for anybody else's story, but, you go, it's all very physical. You're having to make decisions, mastectomy, not mastectomy, chemotherapy, what's going to happen with my hair or not, am I going to lose it? Am I going to keep it? And then it sort of once you get through that very, intense time. It comes to more, what does this mean to me on a psychic, emotional level? And I come back to the creativity that can fuel us. And this is just a lovely picture that one of my patients made with her niece and nephew. It's a finger thumb print. And, I often, and again, I'm moving a little bit between things, but when I've talked to families who have survived a suicide, I talk about love lasts longer than death. And I think the art, the creativity is another aspect that has an eternal element to it, and brings comfort during times. So the last concept I want to share, and some of you might be familiar with it, you're looking here at a forest that was burnt down, and then you see some growth. And a useful concept is post-traumatic growth. I actually like Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, who just wrote a terrific book on What Happened to You, which is about trauma. And Bruce Perry talks about post-traumatic wisdom. And I thought I love that even more than post-traumatic growth. But I don't want to minimize that there's not stress that comes with having cancer, having gotten through the pandemic. But Tedeschi is a psychologist who who elucidates about post-traumatic growth. And what it says is that you can, after enduring struggle, what can follow adversity is growth. And that the kinds of things that can happen, and you might want to reflect on whether these have happened for you, is a greater appreciation of life, a strengthening of the relationship with others, a feeling of new possibilities in personal strength, and spiritual change, which makes you think more about how you prioritize your time. So I think this is a little bit both, whether we think about it in the context of the pandemic or cancer, the opportunity for growth is it makes us a little bit less vulnerable, because we can't control what's going to happen in the next test. And that's the picture of post-traumatic growth, showing you it. And this is a picture of Dr. Specht. She was my surgeon. It's when I'm coming in for a checkup towards the end of my recovery. And it's a shout out to all the doctors who may be in the audience who make us strong at a time when we feel vulnerable. And, even now, as I sit here and talk to you about how I've reached into my cancer survival toolkit to navigate this pandemic, I'm also staring down the hole of another mammogram in a few weeks. And so, I've learned a few things, but it's also an uncomfortable dance. And what helps, I hope, all of us, is that we bring our flock around us and dance around our fear. So that's the end of the formal comments that I wanted to do. This, my website's nancyrappaport.com. You can reach out to me or find out more about some of the things that I've talked about. It's been a whirlwind tour, and I want to thank you for asking me to be here. And I'd love to open it up for questions, and feel free. Amy's going to monitor the chat, and maybe, I don't know, Jennifer, Amy, if you want to ask a question first and give people time to think about if they have any question, or we can end if folks don't.
I just want to start off by saying what a really beautiful, inspiring talk, and we're so grateful that you joined us this evening. And we do want to encourage our audience to post questions in the Q&A, but I'll start with a question. So what would you put in your time capsule?
Oh my gosh. Well, I have had the fortune of hearing from about 700 people, wonderful things. First I have to riff on some of the wonderful ones I love that people talked about. Someone talked about putting a Bible, putting a piano, putting a kitchen table with Netflix, a Starbucks cappuccino pumpkin latte, whatever, mask, computer. Those were the big ones that sort of came to mind. Huh. Well, I wouldn't want to, I think I would put, that's great. Nobody's ever turned around and asked me that. You know what I would do? Where's my, hold on. Ziggy, come here. I would take a picture of my dog and put it in the time capsule because my dog Ziggy has been remarkable. She has she's a therapeutic dog anyway, but you know, for many of us who are docs, it's a strange time to be taking care of patients while you're also feeling like you have to make decisions about your own health and your family's safety. And so she was a champion because she didn't know. I mean, you know, I think my daughter came up with a new word for pandemic because she got so tired of hearing that word. But, you know, it was a real comfort to look at my dog. I'm sure this is more information than you want, but it was a real comfort for me to look at my dog and to realize that she didn't know anything about what's going on. As long as she got 2 meals a day and got out for a run or a walk, she's cool. You know, she wasn't thinking about the vaccine or, you know, all the things that we were thinking about. So that's what I would put in my time capsule. Thanks for asking.
That's great.
I also want to say thank you. It was such a wonderful talk and so nice to weave together cancer care and survivorship and child psychiatry, my passion. So it was great. A question that came in was, when is someone designated a survivor? And I'm sure, Amy, you can answer the technical answer, but I'm curious, Nancy, for you, when you felt like, oh, that's the stage I'm in.
Great question. Well, first of all, I don't really like the word survivor, to tell you the truth. I know it's embraced in the cancer community and it's embraced in the suicide community, both places that I've been part of. And in my heart of hearts, it feels like concentration camp survivors are the people who survived an atrocity. And I always feel a little bit uncomfortable for myself, but that's not anything to take away from anybody else. But I can tell you the moment that I went from, so I hope this answers for you, I have cancer to I had cancer. And I had decided to go on a 1-week meditation retreat about 6 months out of my, so I'd gotten over having a mastectomy, having an infection, and had decided I wanted to go to a 1-week silent retreat. And you can see I like to talk, so that was quite the thing to go for a week. And insight meditation out in Barrie. And I remember coming out of the meditation retreat, and instead of saying I have cancer, I said I had cancer. And so it was a verb change. And so that was my flip of, it wasn't the rear view mirror then, but it was a sense that I have been on an adrenaline rush and a fear escalator. And now there's a little bit of grounding. So that's what I'd say. So I don't think, and again, maybe, Amy, there's a technical term, you know, I know we talk about like, if you get out a certain amount of time and you don't have a relapse, you're sort of you're more home free. So I'm sure there's that, but so I'm using a survivor in the emotional realm of things. And I think that's deeply personal for folks.
Oops, there's another question. Thank you for that beautiful answer. How can we teach resilience to patients, to ourselves, and to caregivers? How can we help patients find that rear view mirror that you so beautifully explained at the beginning of your presentation?
So, this is going to sound like I'm dodging. I don't think it's about teach, even though the word docere for doctor is to teach. I think it's about a presence, because I think people watch who we are and what we do, and they learn by osmosis. So I found, I mean, I did feel like that the fact that the oncologist told me that it might be in the rearview mirror created an expectation that of a future orientation that I think was really helpful. And, you know, when I wrote my memoir is not like the I wrote two different books. I wrote the behavior code, which is for teachers, which is around like how, if you have a kid that's oppositional or anxious or has sexualized behavior, like what do you do the next day? That's like a hot seller because it's very cookbooky. The memoir was much more about my own navigating a loss. And I think we live in a world that does strategy cookbooks, how to stop smoking, how to stop addiction. And we leapfrog over attachment. And what I mean by attachment is connection. And if we do small random acts of kindness with our patients, that builds resiliency for them. Just today, I called a patient of mine because I only see her once a month, and I was like, oh, I realized I'm not going to see you for a month, but I wanted to weigh in on X. And letting our patients know that we care about them deeply, or as parents, I talk about bearing witness, and that is so many times as parents, and I think as caretakers, we move into a fix-it mode. And it's hard for us to be in the darkness and not want to turn the light on. We feel like if we don't buoy up the person that we're taking care of, they might drown. But actually, sometimes I talk about joining before you redirect. So I wouldn't, I know how compelling it is to feel like we should offer strategies. Sometimes people ask me, give me the strategy for how to help our kids grieve. Because I talk about ambiguous loss, and I talk about, the fact that ambiguous loss, meaning that, say, like with someone with Alzheimer's, that they're there, but they're not there. They're physically present, but spiritually absent. And we've had a lot of that with the pandemic. So the next question will be, well, let's just, when is that something where a kid is using that as an excuse versus, how do we tie this up into a nice ribbon and sort of say it's done? I think there's going to be a time where there's a learning dip, where we're going to see some regression in kids, and that then if it seems like it's really self-indulgent, that we which is a judgmental word, but we problem solve with them, and think about, well, there's certain things we need to accomplish even though there's been this loss, and how to, and try to sort it out with them. So there's so many different ways of thinking about resiliency, but I would highlight the power of who you bring in your caring of patients instills resiliency. Small acts. I remember a woman rolling me to the operating room who was just so kind to me. And those small acts, they build resiliency in us. So, yeah.
Thank you. A piece of your talk that stood out was the emphasis on the narrative and sort of owning that narrative, or being able to curate it or create it for yourself. And you've clearly done that on a grand scale with a memoir and a one-woman show. Will you remark a little bit more on smaller versions of that narrative?
That's funny you say that, because one of my girlfriends, like, such an overachiever. I mean, you got to have cancer, then you got to do a one-woman show. I mean, like, what's, can't you just like invite some? And it was fun though. It was really absorbing. I think it's a great question. I think it's just, it could be writing a letter to yourself before cancer, writing a letter to your cancer, and having your cancer write a letter back. It could be, so, you could take the survival lessons, read it by Alice Hoffman, and then think about those questions that she talks about in terms of, where would you want to travel? Where have you loved to travel? What do you want to do? What do you want to make sure that you do that you might not have gotten done? How have your priorities changed? It doesn't have it. So that's actually about the first questions, though, about writing a letter to cancer and then having you write it back. That comes actually from drug addiction work, where people write a letter to their drug and then their drug back. But it's also allowing you an opportunity to explore, what does this diagnosis mean to me? How is, how am I allowing it to define me? How am I pushing back at it defining me? What do I think I've lost from this? What do I want to, how do I want to move through this? One of the questions I often talk about, or one of the aspects I show about when I'm talking about the pandemic, is I have these ladies. I love these ladies. They're over 100 years old from the pandemic, from the last pandemic, and they're talking to each other. And I ask the audience, how do you want to be remembered during this pandemic? And it's sort of it's like an inventory time, because we can get a little sloppy around the edges. And I don't want to put burdens on us when we have cancer, but like, I was really touched by how generous people were to me. And it makes me think moving forward about how like I said, I had a little bit of trepidation of coming to talk to you all, because I didn't want to sound like I know everything. And then I have, a relapse, and I'm thinking I tempted the cancer gods. But there's a saying at my son's school, to much who's been given, you give back, sort of kind of idea. So I I appreciate you saying it was not overly ambitious, but it was a big project that I did. But I think, gosh, with all my patients, I spend a lot of time listening to how they want to tell their story. And because I think it's a very healing process to do that. And I don't make them all write memoirs. But if any of you want to write a memoir, I'd be happy to work with you on it.
Thank you. I have a question for you that I think would help a lot of our members of the audience as well. You mentioned yourself that you have your upcoming mammogram, whenever that may be, and that you get nervous about that. So how do you help yourself when you're feeling anxious or nervous about going to get medical tests? Like, how do you counsel yourself about that?
Well, I wish I had an Oprah answer for you. Like, here are I think I try to compartmentalize it up until about 6 weeks before. So it's yearly. So I do good for 45 weeks, and then it's like 7 weeks away and I panic and I start to barter and I start to think about, and I do some of the inventory that I was talking to you about. I sort of do a check on, am I living life? Like, if I had breast cancer tomorrow, I'm really glad I did this talk. So that's how I make those decisions in my life. Like, if I'm going to take, we have 90 hours a week we get to spend on this, and we have a time limit in this world. So what are the things that are going to, make us move forward? And the other thing I try to do, and this is just a cognitive, thank you, it's a good question, a cognitive, behavioral strategy, is not have a future ball, because it's really easy to move past the mammogram to a biopsy, to chemotherapy, to a bone marrow transplant, to death, and to really say, I don't have a future ball. I don't know what's going to happen. The other thing, and you'll probably hate me for saying this, but you're going to hate me for saying this. I probably should edit it, but I don't leave the office until I get the results, because that, after I've had the mammogram, it is so hard for me to manage the anxiety. And so I just block out the day. I've got until somebody decides to take a look at that and tell me I get to leave, because once I'm in there, there's a thing called state dependent learning, which is that when you're in a location, like say you get on a ferry and you drink iced coffee. You might never drink iced coffee, but on the ferry, you drink that iced coffee. And when I walk into that mammogram office, it's like I'm in a time travel back 5 years ago. So it's just a mental gymnastics to try to manage the anxiety. Because I hope it came across to you all. I love life. I love it. I want to suck it dry until I don't have it anymore. And also I have to figure out my relationship with the end. And I learned it probably, maybe 5 or 10 years before some other of my, like, people will be catching up to me around that thing. You know, I don't think people in their early 50s are always thinking about mortality, but I'm also a little weird. I've been the kind of person who's like planning my funeral since I was 40. So, I mean, I'm a little morbid. So it's not an exact answer. Can you ask me another question so I don't end on that note?
I'll let Dr. Koch, it's her turn. We're going back and forth here, so.
Yeah, no, actually, it's not morbid, but actually there was a comment from one of our wonderful colleagues that it's interesting that some of these steps follow a similar step with grieving and loss, and she said she imagined that there's many aspects of grief and loss within a cancer diagnosis, and I'm wondering if it's something you want to say a little bit more about. And you're getting lots of thanks in the chat as well. You should know people are so appreciative for your openness.
Appreciate that. So the question was around grief and loss.
Yeah,
and
similarities.
Of grief and loss within the pandemic and grief and loss within cancer, or grief and loss, how it's episodic.
If I'm interpreting it correctly, it's the similarity of the process of grieving and loss to the cancer diagnosis process, the emotional process. Forgive me if I've misinterpreted the question, but that's my interpretation.
Yeah, I think a little bit. Thank you, because it makes me realize I love to teach, so it always makes me think. Oh, you know, I think when we were talking about the control, what you can control and what you can't control, there's grief that comes from that. That's a very the nice part about the pandemic. It was a collective grief. You know, and it's sometimes people speculate about that. Is that the reason why we have a decrease in suicide right now? Is because that was a collective experience that we had a loss. We went very quickly into lockdown, and we had an abrupt change in our life. And that's also what can happen with the diagnosis. You're going along, you think nothing is the matter, and then boom, you know, you've got this diagnosis. So that's, so I guess, to me, that's one aspect of grief, is around what you control and what you don't control. I think there's a grief that if you have been someone who feels somewhat invincible or strong, and then you have to, you can't, you spend, like when Alice Hoffman talks about, you spend a day looking at a tree, which I did one day. That's tough if that's not your internal experience. So there's the grief of, and then I think, you know, there's the aspect when someone was asking about the survivor versus the non, when you move into that, there's also the idea of permanency. Like, is this permanent, that I'm a cancer patient, or is this temporary? So I think the question's a great one, because how you, the things that are coming at you impact the grieving process, I guess is what I'd say. So.
Thank you. There's also, just following up on the chat box, and there's a comment from one of our participants about looking at relationships before cancer, before the pandemic, and sort of looking at parallels, and how one, you know, I'm assuming, finds those individuals that one wants to spend time with, and those who we care about and who we choose to have fun with. And, you know, I think it's just interesting looking at those. I think you alluded to this, how relationships can change under.
First of all, I don't know about you all, but I feel like coming out of the pandemic, we have to, which is similar to cancer, which is that you want to have boundaries, because now everybody wants to be socializing with us, and we want to make sure we leave time to be spending friendships and family that nurture us and don't deplete us. So I think that's a parallel process of that. And I think, you know, I guess the reason I brought up about relationships is I don't think that's often talked about. I think we are catapulted into a very scary time, both as someone who has cancer and someone who loves a partner that has cancer. And that can, because you have that idea of wanting an omniscient parent and longing to have someone meet your needs, you sometimes can have unrealistic expectations or be disappointed, and that can have stress lines. And I think there's a repair process that ideally can happen, but you can't have a repair process if you can't even, if we're not sensitized to really recognizing that it would be anticipated that this could be stressful in a relationship, and to be nurturing to each other and attentive to how that may impact us. So, and one other quick thing, I think the whole idea about what you control and what you can't control during the pandemic completely was open for negotiation. If you're for me, it would come out with being in the car, because my husband loves to listen to the pandemic news, and it makes me out of my mind to hear it, because I'm living it. I'm talking to my patients about it 24/7. So that negotiation of what you hear and what you don't hear, and I think also with cancer, it can be that partners can have different appetite for how they approach the cancer. One person might want to be super knowledgeable about the statistics and the process, and another person might feel like that's a burden for me to do it, to hear about that. And so there's a titration, I think, that's happening that can be, it's a negotiation, Paris negotiation.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated. Thank you. I'm just checking, Jennifer, I don't know if you saw any additional questions. Well, it is 7:59, and so we are so appreciative of your time and sharing your wisdom with us on this really important topic. And I know I was taking lots of notes because some of your book recommendations, I definitely am going to check those out. So thank you so much for your time. We are so appreciative. And I do want to put in a plug for our webinar that's in 2 weeks, which is, following up on some of these themes. It'll be on Wednesday, June 16th, 7 o'clock, same time, same place. And the title will be Putting Stress in Its Place and How We Can Keep Calm. And we have some wonderful colleagues from the Cancer Center who will be speaking, Rochelle Lemaster, Michelle Shields, and Julia Kenny. And they're all wonderful for those of you who have worked with them. And I know it's going to be a very practical demonstration of strategies for how we can stay calm under stressful conditions. So I'm really looking forward to that one.
Yay. So nice.
You're welcome to join
much.
too.
I really appreciate
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Yes. Good night. Virtual hug to you all. Bye.
Bye.